At issue this week, a new salvo and heated rhetoric over the federal carbon tax. Saskatchewan says it won't pay up. Ottawa says that's breaking the law.
It's irresponsible and it's frankly immoral on his part. We can have disagreement about things like climate change, but to be so reckless is unspeakable, really.
If the decision is immoral in Saskatchewan, that means it's immoral in the latter county, and so that it's disappointing.
What's to be made of the battle, the ongoing battle between Saskatchewan and Ottawa? What measures might the federal government take to enforce the tax? Hello there, I'm Rosemary Barton, here to break it all down tonight. Andrew Coyne, Althia, and sitting in for Chantal tonight, Kelly Cryderman. Good to see all of you. Maybe I'll start with you, Andrew. What do you make of the way Minister Guilbeault has responded? Obviously, he's not the only minister that's talked about this issue, and there does seem to be some question of how Ottawa is actually going to respond. But for now, calling this decision immoral, how do you think that contributes to where we are with this?
Well, I think we want to be careful not to both sides this. We can all be critical of the way the federal government has handled the carbon price file generally, and particularly the carve out for home heating oil, which I think is widely and rightly seen as being a sop to their Atlantic Canadian base. All that's true, and maybe they're guilty of hypocrisy or what have you. But we cannot have governments of all people in this country who are supposed to be framing and enforcing the laws stepping outside them. People would like to say, oh, Guilbeault himself in his past used to engage in illegal stunts to make a point as a Greenpeace campaigner, but he wasn't in the government of Canada at the time.
No, he wasn't.
So I do think that we have to draw a line here. That the government of Saskatchewan has agency. It's not an automaton. It can make choices. It can make choices to make its protests within the law of the land, and to be stepping outside of this. And it's far from the only province that's been doing this, of course. We've got Alberta with this cockamamie Alberta sovereignty thing, which is clearly outside the law. You've got Quebec presuming to be able to rewrite drafts of the sections of the Constitution unilaterally, which is clearly unconstitutional. This is getting out of hand, and whether Guilbeault is the right man and the right message to be handling this is another question, but I can't fault him for at least the emotion behind it.
But the Saskatchewan government is trying to make what they believe, and what many people believe, Althea, is a legitimate point. So, I mean, yes, they're going to extremes to do that, but they are trying to find a way to get the federal government to respond, because so far they haven't agreed to any further carve-outs.
What the Saskatchewan government is doing is blatantly illegal. It's not a perception of it being illegal or not. It's not like the debate we're having over whether or not to use the notwithstanding clause preemptively or not. It is clearly illegal. Manitoba's Premier Wab Kinew has said publicly that the advice that he received was taking the similar action is also illegal. The government of Saskatchewan has gone to the Supreme Court to fight Ottawa on the imposition of the carbon tax, and they may disagree about, the exception on home heating, which does actually apply in Saskatchewan as well. It applies across the country, but it lost that battle, and we do live in a society where the rule of law should be upheld, and it's really disappointing. And I agree with Stephen Guilbeault. It is irresponsible. I'm not sure I would call it immoral. Those are his words. I'm not sure I would use that. But it is irresponsible. What message does it send the people of Saskatchewan? If you don't like a law, you can break it. You don't want to pay your income tax. You disagree with the government. Go ahead, break the law. That's, the government is siding on the side of anarchy, and it's not lost, I think, on any of us that there is an election in Saskatchewan in October, and that the Premier would very much like to stick it to Justin Trudeau. They're kind of battling it out in the polls at the moment. And fighting with the federal government is always a win, but they know it's illegal. They know it's illegal because they have tried to protect the board of Sask Energy from criminal prosecution. We don't know what the government is going to do yet, but Stephen Guilbeault has said clearly the government has to do something, and they cannot allow provinces to break the law.
Well, I mean, Minister Wilkinson has said, we don't want to go down the path of handcuffing the minister here. Like that, creating a martyr around carbon tax probably is not what the federal government wants to do either, Kelly. But it does seem like things are kind of stuck in terms of how far they are willing to go to make their point to Saskatchewan.
It is a bit of a stalemate, and absolutely what Saskatchewan is doing is illegal. And I think the indications that we're hearing from Minister Wilkinson is that they will be hit with a fine or some kind of clawback of transfer payments. And I think you can disagree with the tactics of the Saskatchewan government, but also feel that they're also, bringing up a fair point about the way that the carbon pricing has evolved since the Supreme Court decision in 2021, since the federal Liberals said a floor on carbon pricing wouldn't be moved and then just suddenly moved for Atlantic Canada. I think there is a question of blatant unfairness. And I was thinking back to the days 25 years ago when I came back to Alberta, and there was farmers fighting the Canadian Wheat Board, and they were getting arrested for crossing the border and selling their wheat or grain. Now, we are talking about a government here. We are not talking about a group of deeply unhappy farmers. We are talking about a government, and forever, any citizen of Saskatchewan will be able to look at the Saskatchewan Party and say, hey, you fought the law, I'm not going to pay my taxes. That is the big risk they're taking here. But it is going to be hard for Canadians for many Canadians to get upset about this, given the issue of fairness. And I also think given the issue of the way that the loss of political support on the carbon pricing issue, which is, of course, a different issue than the law, but it does contribute to how the Liberals are able to maneuver on this.
Yeah, well, talk to me about that, Andrew, then, because Kelly makes a point. Like, you don't want to make this into a bigger issue than they already have. So how do you respond and respond to the fact that it is illegal, but you do understand that people are upset?
Well, I think the point is well taken. You don't want to create martyrs. At the same time, you also want to emphasize this is not just a usual argy-bargy between the feds and the provinces. So withholding transfer payments, et cetera, that is helpful. Yeah, that's one way of affecting it. But I think they also has to be some way of making a point that this is stepping outside some pretty fundamental norms. Our neighbors to the south are entering a very perilous period. Where they are going to be, there's the real potential for lawlessness, political lawlessness in that country. We've always prided ourselves in this country as being a bit more law-abiding, a bit more orderly. That would not be a high bar to meet at this point. But it's a little distressing to see us going down closer towards that kind of road. We've just had the discussion vis-a-vis the Ottawa convoy that we needed to have an even hand. We needed to have commitment to the rule of law on all sides. That people quite rightly said, why are you getting so mad at us in the convoy when you weren't getting mad at people for blockading railways? And the correct answer to that was, well, let's not let any of that happen. Let's have a commitment that we resolve our disputes peacefully and lawfully in this country. And to have a government, I'll repeat the point, stepping outside the law is just disgraceful.
Althia, about 30 seconds to you.
I mean, to Andrew's point, peace, order, and good government. You may think we don't have a good government, but it doesn't give you the right to not support order. So I do share Andrew's point about the sort of Americanization of our politics. When you look down south at what's happening in Congress, you have a number of representatives who don't seem at all interested in abiding by the norms that, have long been. We did not get to this level of democracy because it was an easy ride. People fought very hard for us to have strong institutions, to have the rule of law, and behavior like this all hits at that.
Last word to you, Kelly.
I just point out I'm more interested, I agree with the points on law and the rule of law in the United States, but we are seeing even a movement among states in the U.S. that, maybe might even be following Canada's lead or Western Canada's lead in some respects in terms of distancing themselves from a central government. So I think those ideas flow back and forth over the border.
Okay, we're going to take a short break. Thanks for that. Good part of the conversation. When we come back, we'll discuss the Winnipeg lab leaks.
This is a grave and serious matter that requires a parliamentary committee to examine.
Conservatives say the Liberals are again shutting down attempts to find out more about what happened at Canada's top infectious disease lab. Is more transparency needed? That's next. At issue, allegations of a cover-up. The Conservatives are demanding more answers about what happened at the National Microbiology Lab and why it took so long to reveal a trove of intelligence documents that detail why 2 scientists were fired, accused of sharing information with China.
We need to understand why we didn't get these documents 3 years ago. We've lost 3 years in examining this matter because there was an overclassification of these documents and Parliament didn't get the information it should have gotten.
So is there a need for further investigation into what happened at that lab? Let's bring everybody back. Andrew, Althia, and Kelly. Althia, why don't you start us off out here? It did take a long time, in part because there was no agreement on the process to look at these documents. They have finally now been basically made public, but there's still lots of questions. There's more questions, I would say, now that we have the documents. Do you think that the government has been fair enough in their approach to sharing this information, given national security concerns?
Fair is a hard question. The reason it's not like all the opposition parties agree that these governments needed to be seen, which is why the Speaker ruled to have the documents, and then the government decided to sue the Speaker to prevent the documents from being released. Yeah. And when you realize that PHAC overly redacted the documents, and then the Liberals, I mean, it was a good thing. We should credit them for following the kind of Afghan model plus, I think, because of the jurists there that were weighing the national security concerns as well. We had a nice example, actually, of all parliamentarians working together to bring to light the documents that we saw last week, which are shocking. And absolutely, I agree with Michael Chong that parliamentarians should absolutely look at what's been revealed in the documents. I think we take security incredibly not seriously enough. We are much too lax with security, and this is one thing that is really quite disturbing from the documents. But I will say that I don't know, it's hard to distinguish the partisan gamesmanship from the actual interest to the public. Like what we saw this week with the Conservatives at the Ethics Committee, where they are there because they have a Conservative chair, so there's an opposition majority. This debate probably should be happening at the Canada-China Committee, but that has a Liberal chair. But that is where the impetus for all these documents started for. So I do think there are questions of accountability. We still don't know who knew what, when, what they did about it in the government, why it took so long for this information to be released. And I don't think that we can forget the context at the time, which is the Meng Wanzhou detention and the 2 Michaels and possible, hyper sensitivity in the government about what to do with regards to China and any backlash they might face.
It's curious to me, Andrew, though, that the Liberals are still shutting down attempts at I'm trying not to be naive here, but to shut down attempts at committee to discuss this, because you would think that after this long, they would understand that transparency actually might help them as a government to answer questions and to put it all on the table. You would think. Well,
first of all, what's in the documents is utterly scalding. This may well be the most serious national security breach in the history of the country. You had basically the government of China setting up a cell within our most top security bio research lab involving some of the most lethal viruses known to man, and sending out information over to China, bringing in people including people from the People Liberation Army to research there. The whole thing is absolutely shocking, and it's only going to get more shocking, I imagine, the more we'll delve into it. So they still probably have an interest in trying to obstruct that. But let's be clear, the bedrock convention of our system of government is that the government is accountable to Parliament. It's not accountable to Parliament if it agrees to be or subject to certain conditions. It is accountable to Parliament. When Parliament demands documents, one of the other most bedrock convention is the government has to yield them. It doesn't get to say, wait a minute, we think national security is involved, or maybe it's privacy, or maybe it's some other matter. That's for Parliament to decide, and parliamentarians. So I'm not particularly enamored of the process that got us here. It was messy and ugly and wrong and unconstitutional. Thank God we have finally seen it 3 years too late, and probably too late to do much about it, the people involved. But we certainly need to learn much more about how this happened, why it took so long to bring these people to find out what the people were doing, and certainly we need to confront this weakness in our institutional mechanisms that we can't actually call our governments to account.
Well, and to better protect Canada from future attempts, right, to be influenced by other countries. I mean, Althia mentioned the Afghan detainee situation that happened under Stephen Harper. In that situation, in my mind and in my memory, it was very painful for the government until they released the documents. It actually helped the government once the documents were out because people had at least a better sense of what they were dealing with. Kelly.
Yeah, I don't understand the reason at this point for bringing any political attention to the fact that you're trying to stop any process from happening at this point. You know, I keep sticking on Michael Chong's words about things being overclassified, and perhaps Andrew's absolutely right that there are worse things to come out. But I think at this point, if you are talking about cutting through partisan political lines and acting in the name of national security, to me it would be better to be more forthcoming on the threat that existed for Canada, for the lab, for some of our research secrets. And I think, there has to be an acknowledgement that the Liberals have talked about that things have changed politically so quickly since 2018, 2019 for sure. In terms of the threat assessment. But there comes a point where that starts to ring hollow and you need to start acting in a more grown-up way, even getting past some of the really divisive arguments of the pandemic and the discussion about people in committee chastising Michael Chong for even bringing up the Wuhan lab because that was connected to so-called conspiracy theories at the time. And I think getting past that thinking and to a more grown-up thinking on foreign affairs is really important at this point, and it will cut down conservative arguments that the Liberals are holding back on this.
Andrew, you want in there, and then quick last word to Althia.
Can I just say, this line that Mark Holland was putting out that, 2019 was a simpler time, we didn't know what China was up to. The two Michaels were languishing in a Chinese jail at the time in 2019. So let's not kid ourselves
on
here.
Espionage?
People knew. People
right.
knew that what China was up to.
Yeah, and the kind of things that they would do to retaliate. Althia, last word to you.
I think one of the questions that comes out of this is more of a process-y question, but we are supposed to have a national parliamentarian committee that looks at national security. Yep. And clearly it isn't working properly. The Conservatives do not want to actively participate because they feel like they're being gagged if they do. We should have the ability, and by we I mean Parliament should have the ability to compel documents from the government and have its own body internally that redacts things. MPs should get security clearances, different levels of security clearances, because you can't assume that all MPs actually deserve a top secret security clearance. But we should have a system that allows parliamentarians to access documents without relying on the bureaucracy that has its own agenda. And we can never forget that. The bureaucracy also has its own agenda.
We have to take a short break here, but when we come back, we'll look at that pharmacare legislation and whether it lives up to the promises of the Liberals and the NDP. That's next. Ottawa's long-awaited pharmacare legislation was unveiled last week. While it promises to cover two classes of drugs very quickly, the step toward universal drug plans are broadly laid out but will need provincial buy-in.
Moving forward on pharmacare for contraceptives and diabetes medications just makes sense in terms of not just being there for Canadians and making sure they have all the opportunities to succeed and have great, fulfilled lives.
The promise of this deal means the Liberals will stay in power with NDP support, but does the legislation really deliver what the NDP wanted? Let's bring everybody back. Andrew, Althia, Kelly. Kelly, I haven't started with you yet, so I'll start with you. Do you think that, obviously it's enough, the NDP are like, okay, but I wonder whether it gets us closer to the promise of universal pharmacare in actual fact.
I think the description of a proof of concept or a pilot is a good one. And, even compared to 10 days ago in terms of how quickly I thought this would happen, that's changed. Now we're talking about next year, which would be very convenient for the Liberals and maybe for the NDP as well, as will probably be an election, and it might be a useful wedge issue to use against the Conservatives in 2025. So even if it does come into force next year politically, that could work for the Liberals and the NDP. But I think there is a bigger question about the priorities for federal spending that we're going to hear about ad nauseum until the budget in April, and we do have a government that is far more pressed on its finances, of course, and with a lot of economic uncertainty. And I think politically, this is a very good compromise if you are a fan of this partnership, if you're a fan of keeping the NDPs and the Liberals in control of the House of Commons, that it is not the full meal deal in terms of pharmacare, and there's no guarantee actually we will get to this point, but it is a kind of foray into that area, and it will be difficult, politically it will be very difficult for the Conservatives to fight against the idea of giving universal access to contraceptives and diabetes drugs. At the same time, I think those economic and financial issues will continue to weigh on the country more, and they may get pushed back in that regard.
And a large part of this promise, though, is about whether provinces are going to buy in, Althia. So, I mean, a lot of the delay will also be those kinds of negotiations, too.
I wouldn't be surprised if most of the provinces agree, and frankly agree pretty quickly. Mark Holland, the health minister, has shown himself to be quite flexible. In fact, he's so flexible that I wonder if the Prime Minister has spoken to the Health Minister, because they don't actually seem to be singing from the same songbook. To hear Mark Holland speak, this is just an experiment. Like, we're going to test out the public system with these two categories of drugs that are already cheap because they're mostly in generic form. And then we're going to decide whether or not, actually a committee, a year after royal assent, so this may happen actually after the next election, so it may not happen at all, we'll decide if there's enough data upon which to make a determination about which system is better, if we should have a single payer system, or if we should have a fill-in-the-gap system, or maybe we don't have any system at all because we had an election and we voted for a government that decided we don't want pharmacare. So it is entirely a political compromise. It doesn't even fulfill, if you look at the wording that the NDP delegates gave NDP leader Jagmeet Singh last October, doesn't even fulfill that requirement because it's supposed to be comprehensive, and this is only two categories of medication. So this is just, $1.5 billion perhaps, because we don't even know, it's going to be in next year's budget, to please Jagmeet Singh in a bill, a piece of legislation that may or may not deliver anything.
I mean, I felt your cynicism there. I felt it there, Althia.
Well, I feel like there's a lack of a reality check in this discussion. To hear the Prime Minister speak, we're on the pathway to full public pharmacare, and that is actually not what the bill says.
No, there's a big maybe attached to it. I would agree. Andrew, your thoughts?
Well, I hadn't realized until now just how cheaply the NDP's virtue could be bought. It's remarkably minimal. It is two classes of drugs that are already covered by most private plans and some public plans. It's contingent on the provinces buying in. Look, the only point of this is to shut the NDP up until election time, to give the Liberals something to wave at them and saying, we gave you some kind of concession on that. I suspect we will not hear a great deal about pharmacare during the election because the polling data on this is pretty clear. Most people are pretty happy with their private coverage. When we say single payer, that's a nice euphemism for government monopoly. And I do not think there is a large constituency in this country for people to give up the coverage they already have under their private plans for a government plan that would necessarily be less comprehensive in its coverage. I think this achieved what the Liberals wanted, which was to basically get the NDP to shut up about this and give them some more time until the next election.
Very quickly, Althia.
I was going to say, an industry will spend, multi-millions of dollars to convince us that Andrew is right.
Yeah. Okay, thank you all for being here.
I appreciate
it. Well, we're not all convinced, Andrew. It takes more than that. Okay, thank you all for weighing in. I appreciate it. Have a good weekend.